Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the second ZenCon day. And also thank you for coming here in the big room, especially since this is one of the very few talks that has absolutely nothing to do with PHP. So thanks to the organizers for actually having me for that talk. As you saw in the keynote yesterday morning, if you've been there, the mobile story is one of the most important aspects, at least according to Zen and other people, that will be instrumental for companies and applications to have a look at. And if you saw in the keynote what Zen is doing with their tooling, that they embrace HTML5 and using HTML5 and other web technologies as a basis for mobile applications, then I think you'll be as excited as I am on all of the new features that are coming up. So what I want to do today in this session is I'd like to have a look at HTML5, and actually the name HTML5 is a bit misleading because HTML5 has, well, very little to do with HTML, if you ask me. I mean, if you look at the specification, you see a lot of HTML and HTML elements, but many of the elements were already there when HTML4 came about. And HTML4 is, I think, from 1997-ish or 1998, so it's really old, and everything has already been there then. So HTML5 does add some new HTML elements because the name should suggest it. However, HTML5 also adds a lot of JavaScript APIs, a lot of interfaces you can use from JavaScript language. And using these interfaces give you new possibilities that just have not been possible with web applications in the last decades. If you remember when the web was invented, the web had exactly two use cases. The first use case was display documents. The second use case was link those documents. These are the sole two use cases the web had back then. Now, of course, the web has evolved, the web has changed, new features came about. However, in the end, the technologies are still the same for those two use cases. However, we have many more use cases. And a few of those use cases are now supported by HTML5 and everything that is HTML5. I will use the term HTML5 in quite a liberal fashion today because there is the HTML5 2B specification. There are other specifications that are tied to HTML5 or kind of related to HTML5 or at least have something to do with the web. By looking at all of this and also looking at selected items, selected features, selected functionality, selected interfaces, I think you will get quite a nice overview of what is possible. I will not talk too much about the current discussion going on. Should there be HTML5 or should HTML be a living standard, which is never complete? And there are kind of opposing fractions that are working on this, and they're really battling it out. Personally, I don't care. I would like to have a standard that's finished because that means it doesn't change. So backwards compatibility is not so hard if we have something we can rely on. On the other hand, I'm very well aware that progress needs to be made so that people need to work on a standard, and if they see that something doesn't work out as planned or is limited or some design issues come up, they need to be fixed. Of course, if there is an API which is not good enough, as one may find out whatever half a year later, but it's already implemented in browsers, then it gets really messy because then you might have code which won't run after a browser update. Now, since most browser updates nowadays, except for IE and to some extent Opera, are silent browser updates or quite silent browser updates, that's quite a tough situation. But I don't care too much about that, at least today. My name is Wenz, and I'm one of the founders of a German web agency with offices in Munich and in London. And we do web applications and mobile applications and social media strategies. We work for a lot of medium-sized and large-sized companies and enterprises. And so one of our daily business is to solve web problems. So we always have a look at emerging web technologies and are always very eager to try stuff out to find out if it's good for our customers and if we could make very interesting applications out of those technologies or not. So we evaluated HTML5 since, well, actually literally a few years now, and there are really some APIs we like and some APIs we kind of like, but do not want to use it right away, but maybe when they stabilize a bit more or if browsers support them better. And there are some APIs which, well, we don't like for some reason or another. And I'd like to show you a little bit of all of them, of course with a focus on the stuff we liked. And feel free to send me an email if there are any topics you would like to discuss further, because it's a very, very swiftly moving world at the moment. So standards or proposals for standards or APIs, they just evolve very, very quickly, and browsers get an update every few weeks. So it's very interesting yet challenging times, and I'd like to share some of the experience we made there with you. Now, I have an agenda, so you saw I prepped quite a bit for that. So I would like to talk about new HTML elements, just to give you an idea about one of the versions the HTML5 specification and movement has, at least in my opinion. So we'll have a look at that and discuss that a little bit. I'd like to talk about a feature called geolocation, which might or might not be able to determine the current position. So that should be interesting. I'd like to give you the background story for offline applications, because HTML5 contains several technologies or several ways to make an application offline aware, and I'd like to discuss them with you and also show you one or two of those. Then I'd like to talk about web workers. That's a way to run slow or complex JavaScript code in a fashion that doesn't block the browser. I'd like to discuss the communication story and even more. So there's a lot of stuff to cover. I hope I'll be able to go through all of my slides in the remaining 55 minutes or so, but I think if I talk fast enough, then actually we can do that. No, seriously, you know from a keynote that there was always a green elephant. Now, unfortunately, they didn't give me a green elephant. Actually, I ordered a ship full of green elephants, because this has been my last slide for today. All I want to do today is discuss with you and make live demos. So odds are that something will actually go wrong. And I don't have any elephants. I have a few water bottles. So if you're interested, just wave, and I try to throw them, but maybe first kind of sign a waiver that I didn't do anything you didn't want to. No, seriously, nothing to raffle away, but anyway, so let's just dive right in. Now, there are a lot of new HTML elements in HTML5, and most of them are semantic HTML elements, because we don't have any semantics in HTML, right? So if we have like a section on our website which contains navigation, which HTML element are we usually using for that? Well, we use a div element, and then we assign ID equals nav, or ID equals navigation, or class equals nav, class equals navigation. So we just have a block element, and then we give this block element some metadata, and this metadata is then used by CSS to style it. Now, if we have a footer section on our website where whatever, we have our terms of service and other unimportant links and contact and whatever, what are we using? We're using a div element and then assign an ID or a class, but we don't have any semantics. It's just a block element. Now, what the team behind HTML5 did was they tried to find out as many, well, use cases and scenarios, and, well, actually they counted IDs on the web and classes, which one were used most often. And this eventually turned into a couple of new HTML elements. So there is a new HTML element for a navigation section called nav. There's a new HTML element for footer called footer. There are HTML elements for sections, for articles. A side is for sidebars, and all of them gain you, at least at first, absolutely nothing, because there is no styling involved with it. One of the maybe design issues of HTML before CSS came about was that some HTML elements come with specific style and layout information, like whatever, the font tag, for instance, or blink. You know, all those tags we have been using for years, and now don't admit that we have ever seen them. Now, this of course, this changes a little bit with HTML5. Now, we have elements who do not have any layout information associated with them, but we have semantics associated with them. So we can say this is a navigation element, and this is a footer element. And actually, that's quite important. Think about accessibility. So if someone can't see very well, or not at all, and is using a screen reader, a special browser or software that reads contents of a web page. We've worked on a specific project which was using a lot of screen readers in the target audience, and it's really fascinating watching that because the software reads quite quickly. It reads, but still everything is read. So logo, all the alt tags of images, logo, all the navigation elements. So if you have in your navigation you have 100 links, then all these 100 links are read. After those have been read, maybe we come to the content. Now, if the browser knows, oh, this is a navigation section, and might prompt the user, do you want the navigation section or do you want to dive in right to the content? Well, another problem solved. And this is one of the main reasons why we have the new semantic elements and why it's probably not such a bad idea to use them. And if you go to whatever the Apple homepage, for instance, they're using them quite a lot, and other big sites as well, of course. There are some issues involved with that, especially if you want to support older browsers as well, especially older IE versions are a bit of a trouble, but there are workarounds, so most of this can be solved. But still, immediately you gain nothing, but it's kind of a bet on the future. Because maybe eventually search engines think that something that is part of a side element of a sidebar is maybe not as important as stuff that might be in a header section or might be in another specific section on the page. So as more and more websites will use these HTML5 elements, the significance of those elements and the support of those elements will increase. So I think it's important to have a look at that quite early. The other set of new HTML5 elements is also kind of related to semantic elements. And the thing is, if I create a new HTML5 page, I'm talking about form elements. Think about form elements in HTML. We don't have that many form elements, right? We have text fields, text, multi-line text password fields, radio buttons, checkboxes, buttons, file upload, selection list. Kinda that's it, right? There's not much more, and of course, most data you want to input can be represented by this set of elements, but sometimes we want to have semantics. And one of those semantics, for instance, and that's one of the prime examples for me, is something like this. So I have a new field. So the input element has been in HTML since ages, of course, but there are new type or new values for the type attribute. So input type equals email. All right. I know you are as excited as I am to see how this is going to look like. So this is an email field, right? All right, let's load this. This is an email field. Awesome, isn't it? Well, actually, it's not that awesome, right? It's a very simple text field. Okay, that's a bit underwhelming. So let's try something else. What I always wanted is a date field. Input type equals date, like a built-in date picker. That would be awesome, wouldn't it? Actually, let's add a submit button as well. All right, let's load this. That's a date field. That's also a little bit underwhelming. I think it's time for the green elephants to come out if I don't find anything better. Now, I happen to have here a mobile emulator for a few mobile phones. So I don't have any preference. Oh, a friend of mine has this. Battery lasts for at least a week. So let's try to open this here. And then we need to scroll in a little. And then you see, oh wow, we got a date picker. That's awesome. So on a mobile phone, we might get a date picker here. And well, then there still is this email field, and there is no on-screen keyboard for that specific phone. So I would use T9 to enter something here. Now, maybe the situation gets a bit better if I have another phone. Let's take this phone or tablet to be exact. And because this has an on-screen keyboard. And maybe you get an idea what these fields are good for. Now, you saw already that we have a date picker if you use input type equals date. But if we have an email field, at first we do not gain anything because, well, the it's just a text field. However, on mobile devices, we have the on-screen keyboard. And didn't you notice when you were using your smartphone, and I assume that almost everybody in here has a smartphone, and if you don't, actually you are quite a cool guy or a cool girl, because very few people can resist to have a smartphone all of the time. Now, didn't you notice that when you were filling out something in an email field, that the on-screen keyboard looked a bit different, so that the @ character kind of was, you know, on the front view of the keyboard, as was any other characters you needed an email address, like dot? Or didn't you once wanted to enter a URL, and then the colon and the slash was on the front view of the keyboard? So you had specific keyboards for specific data you wanted to input, and that's semantics, right? I tell the browser who renders my HTML that this field is there to hold an email address. And so the browser can act upon that. The browser can just say, well, I don't care. It's just a text field, but if, for instance, the browser has on-screen keyboards, the browser could take the appropriate on-screen keyboard for that. And the specification, says, it's not a direct quote, but what it means is that this information can and should be used in order to give a better user experience, for instance, by providing these specific on-screen keywords or a date picker. Now, this is a kind of vanilla date picker. This date picker probably would not work on the actual device because, I mean, you see it here on the big screen, but just imagine this was a tablet or a phone. Who of you has fingers that are small enough to hit like one of those buttons? I mean, I have issues hitting that with my mouse pointer, but still, I mean, you would? I wouldn't. So, so the date picker might look differently, and indeed it does. If you run this on Apple hardware, well, not on generic Apple hardware, on Apple mobile hardware, no, not mobile hardware, MacBook is also mobile hardware, on Apple phones or tablets, then you get the iOS date picker. If you run this on a Windows phone, you get the all squares Windows Phone date picker. And on Android, you get the Android date picker. So you have an experience that the website kind of looks like she belongs on that system because you have the system UI for those things. And if people see system UI, they automatically or already know they have learned how to use it. So you have better results in any usability tests. And if you want to go from HTML5 eventually to a native app like the Zen Studio feature suggested yesterday in the keynote, then this is a vital step, right? Because then the app looks like it was really made for the device. So that's very important, and there are a lot of other fields like URL field and time picker, and there's even a color picker. Yes, in HTML5 we do have a color picker. I don't know what it's good for, actually, but it is still there, so we can have a color picker now in our web forms, which I think is really, really interesting, and it doesn't cost that much effort to implement it because the fallback solution is easy. If you have a browser that doesn't know those new types, it just displays a text field, a simple text field. So I can add something here, I can try to submit the form, and actually submitting the form doesn't work because the browser knows the semantics. The browser knows that this is an email field. So if I enter something to the email field, it better be an email address. So it is validating that email address and gives me a distinctive error message. So I need to enter an email address here. Once I enter an email address in that field, so you see that the red border appears and vanishes while I'm typing. So this is correct, this is correct, this is correct, this is actually correct because in your local network example could resolve to a real server. So that's a correct email address and well, incorrect. Theoretically correct again, right? So really, really convenient, and this built-in validation, of course, requires that we have a new strategy in order to validate our content, because maybe we already have validation, whatever, using the validate plugin of jQuery or any other kind of client-side validation, but this blends in quite nicely, and we have CSS classes for that, so we can determine or find out is a field in an error state or not, and then have a different different layout option for that. We can actually use JavaScript in order to find out if a field has been filled out correctly or not, so we can write our own code that taps into that. So really, really convenient, and I think one of the nicer HTML5 additions in terms of new elements. So we have a couple of new form elements. They have a semantic meaning. Thanks to the semantic, we can have stuff like specific input options, like on-screen keyboards, and we can have a built-in validation. So that's really, really convenient, but well, so far that's only HTML. Now let's move on a little bit to JavaScript, and I would like to start with a feature that actually it's a simple feature, but nevertheless it's quite impressive what can be done with that, and I would like to show you that and then give you some background information. I just start because I tend to forget this a lot. Make this an HTML5 HTML file, and I will use some JavaScript in it, and one of the novelties of HTML5 is that type equals text / JavaScript is the default, so you don't have to edit actually, so this would still be okay. And what geolocation does, it tries to determine the current position of the browser or of the machine the browser is running on. It doesn't always make much sense on a desktop or on a laptop, more on a mobile device, but still, maybe it should work. Let's see how the internet connection works. So there is the navigator object. You probably know the navigator object usually contains information like which browser is being used. However, I have now geolocation as a new sub-object, and then I have three methods. One is get current position. Now this tries to determine the current position, but just like an AJAX call, this might take some time. So we have an asynchronous pattern here, which means that get current position doesn't directly return anything, but I can provide a callback function, and this callback function is then being used to display the data that came back. So I get a result, and once the position has been determined, and what I'm doing is I'm just logging the result into the console. I think should be easy enough. I'm going back to my browser. I go into my console, so I activate my console. I hope you can see that all right. And then geolocation, PHP, and then immediately browser asks me, would I like to share my location with the server, with localhost? Oh well, I would love to. And after a very, very short while, I got a result here in the console. Now let's have a look at that. It has a timestamp and then has a quartz property, and the quartz property contains, among other things, a latitude and a longitude. It also has values for altitude. Well, altitude 0 probably is not the correct value. Heading, well, speed, I don't have such things on my laptop. But well, the accuracy is 73, and this might be a shock to some of you, but that's meters. So we have the metric scale for that. I'm very happy because I live in meters, but anyway. So we can take the longitude and the latitude. Actually, let's go to any mapping provider and just enter these two values, not that value, this value. So let's enter that in, and the other value as well. And after we've done this, let's see how accurate our position has been determined. All right, 501 Great American Parkway. Okay, not that far. I mean, we are here, supposedly. Actually, this might even be the right room, right? So the determining the position worked really, really well. One of the reasons why it worked so well is that I was using a Wi-Fi connection. If I have a wired connection, it's a bit more complicated, because if I have a Wi-Fi connection, the browser has a lot of information. The Wi-Fi connection itself, maybe the router even has location and latitude and longitude information. But I also have a list of all the Wi-Fi networks that are near here. Maybe some of those Wi-Fi networks somewhere in a database is known, and the position is known, so I can kind of triangulate my position. And all of this information is taken, and then what usually happens is that the browser sends an encrypted request to a service, and that service then returns information like longitude and latitude. Microsoft has one, Google has one, and Apple has one. Then according to that request, information is used. Now, if I would use my mobile device and would run the same example, then the mobile device would probably turn on the GPS that's built into my mobile device. It might also use a GPS, so it would maybe send data packages to all of the cells here and then try to find out where exactly the position is, and might even get an even better result. Well, GPS probably wouldn't work that well because we're in a closed room, but still. So again, how the browser exactly determines the position is none of the HTML5 standards business. HTML5, the standards draft just says, well, use whatever is possible and available, but that's the API, and that's the API we have been using. So this works cross-browser. This query, do you want to allow to track the position, looks a bit different in each and every browser, and of course you cannot avoid it for very, very good reasons. Otherwise, it would be a very, very easy surveillance trick, right? Especially when you're here on a conference and not at home. So you just have to convince your significant other to load a website all of the day. But yeah, but probably, I don't know if that's a good idea. So there is, of course, a check, and this question needs to be answered. But it's geolocation, and I think geolocation is a nice feature, especially if you once again think about mobile web apps, because location-based services that behave or give you data according to where you currently are a very big trend. And I mean, if you have a mobile phone and then you search for something, so last night, for instance, a couple of us were searching for a restaurant. Luckily, the search we were using already determined our position with a very similar API, so we only got restaurants close by and not like restaurants in another city, for instance, or in another state. So geolocation, in my opinion, is a very interesting and very rewarding API. It's a really, really simple API, and a lot of applications can benefit from it. Store locators for wherever your stores are, or kind of connections to mapping systems, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's geolocation. Now, let's go back to my slides. Oh, we have the offline story next. Okay, so offline applications are very, very, very interesting if we want to replace real applications. Let me give you an example. Calendar applications. Let's talk about calendar applications. So of course, most of us do have a calendar application, whatever. It might be an Outlook or Lotus Notes or using anything else. But well, if you have a calendar application, that's something that just works with your schedule. What do you have? What are your kind of use cases? Okay, it needs to load or it needs to start. Okay, great. It needs to show you a list of items, like a list of appointments you have. You might want to have any kind of write access, so changing existing appointments or creating new appointments. And well, this should be stored somewhere safe, and you have to sync it with there, like in the cloud, or let's just say on a web server. Now, this is kind of possible with a web application, as long as you're online, or have a connection to the server where the application is stored on. Unfortunately, you can never be sure if that's the case. So just imagine, I mean, we're quite far out here from San Jose, so maybe, in the basement of the hotel, maybe you don't have a mobile reception, or then you're riding back home, you're flying home, and during the flight, you obviously are offline, or you're taking the train and you might be offline in some rural areas, whatever. But we cannot be sure whether we are always online or offline, and that's why around HTML5 we have 3 features. These 3 features allow us to make offline applications, or at least give us tools to make it a little bit easier. One aspect is determining if we are online or offline. I think that's the very start. So if I just create a new file, I call it offline, and we just set this up. And what's now new? Some browsers had this for quite some time, but now most of them have it. There is something called navigator.online. And navigator.online, capital L, is a Boolean property that tells us if the user is online or offline. Oh well, that could be interesting, so let's have a look at that. I will just whip up a very simplistic UI. ID equals output. So this is where I would like to write my status. And then I'll create a function, whatever, update status. And in update status, I just do document get element by ID of output dot inner HTML equals, and then navigator online. If so, we are online. Otherwise, we are offline. Okay. So far, so good. Now, determining this is nice, but then we would go back to the 1990s, where most interesting JavaScript code looked like this. Every 500 milliseconds, do the same thing, because we never find out if something changes. It's important to know if you're online or offline, but what's even more important to know is a minute later if you are still online or if you are still offline, or if that has changed. Now, luckily, there are a few events that are now supported by all modern browsers, and these events are fired when the user goes online or the user goes offline. So one way to do this is window at event listener online, whatever, update status, and window at event listener offline, update status. Now, if you work a bit with JavaScript, you know that event handling is kind of like a dark spot on the language, because when the event handling API was developed, browsers were already there, so other browsers just made up some API. Well, no, come on, who am I lying to? Not other browsers made up the API, IE made up an API. So we do still need to do a browser kind of determination and find out which browser we have. So if we have a browser that supports at event listener, then we proceed as follows, and otherwise, if we have a browser that supports attach event, you know which browser that is, then we would do, and that's something which would also support older IEs, so I use document body here and not window. Document body attach events. Now, for some very strange reason, the name of the event always has to start with on in IE. So on, online, awesome. And just think one line ahead. How does this go on? Document body attach event. Yes, on, offline. Yeah, awesome. I mean, if I hadn't kind of seen this before, I wouldn't understand what the code was doing, right? But what is on offline supposed to do? So window attach event on load. So when the page loads, let's also have a look at the status, and also window at event listen load update status. All right, that's a lot of code. So the elephant probability is maybe quite high. How did I call this offline? Okay, so we are online, awesome. And now let's go offline, and now we're offline, okay? So the browser determines that automatically, in theory, but only in theory, because when the browser claims we are offline, then we are. If the browser says we are online, then we probably are. Because, you know, we can be online. I mean, conference networks, right? The conference network here is actually quite decent, right? But I think during the Champions League soccer games during lunchtime, it suspiciously got slow. So I don't know how many of you kind of were watching streams. But still, you can be theoretically online. But since the network is full, actually you're offline. So this is not completely foolproof. This is just an indicator. So offline is offline, online is maybe online. So what you should do is do an additional check if you're really online by sending AJAX requests, for instance. Now, we solved at least part of our calendar problem because we now can find out if you're online or if you're offline, and then can act upon that. And well, what else do we have? Oh yeah, even if you're offline, I'd like to have a list of my appointments. Oh, actually that's easy. So let's assume I load the application, so I have to be online at least once. I load the application, get a list of all of my appointments. These appointments are then stored locally. Storing locally usually means we use cookies. Well, a cookie can hold 4 kilobytes of data. Must be a lot of cookies. But according to the spec, browsers only have to support 20 cookies per domain, so maybe tough luck. Well, there is a new API, or there are several new APIs. They're called web storage or DOM storage, so that's the umbrella term. And then there are two different options. One is local storage and the other one is session storage. Local storage is like a persistent cookie. Session storage is like a session cookie, but with one vital difference. They are not sent back to the server with every freaking HTML request, HTTP request. They just stay there. So local storage, web storage is data that is stored in the user's profile on the machine. So JavaScript can have access to it. JavaScript can write there. JavaScript can read out of that, and you can store a significant amount of data there, actually. Okay, so when I go to my calendar application, and if my calendar application loads the appointments, I store the appointments locally. So if I happen to be offline, I have a copy. Now, if I create a new appointment and I'm still offline, I just store the new appointment locally as well. And once I determine I got online, I sync it with the server. So I solved use case 2, 3, and 4, displaying the list, kind of editing the list, and syncing. Awesome. Was there something missing? Oh yeah, use case number 1. The application needs to load. That's, of course, tricky. Because, I mean, the application loads, it needs to load at least once. If you have a real native application on a smartphone, we have to at least install it while we are online. Well, what then? I mean, we could use the browser cache. So if we are happy, if you're lucky, go offline and try to load a resource. Maybe it's in the browser cache. But the main problem with the browser cache is the maybe component. Maybe something has been stored. And well, if you're developing a lot for the web, and I assume most of you are, you know that browser cache is usually the reason for many inexplicable bugs or glitches we find, right? So browser cache is a maybe thing. Browser cache means the server tells the browser, if you want, you can cache this. And the browser says, well, depends on the weather. But there is a new thing, and the new thing is the application cache or app cache. The app cache turns this around, turns the responsibilities around. The app cache is something where we as developers say, you cache that. Browser, you cache that. And the browser says, yes, I do. Well, maybe the user says, oh no, please don't store any data because it's like surveillance. But generally, this is how it's going to work. So the app cache feature works with something called cache manifest. Cache manifest is a specific file format actually, and it looks like this, cache manifest, and then you just provide a name of a list of items and URLs that should be put into that application cache. So whatever elements.php should be cached, and what else? Let's say offline PHP should be cached as well. But what you can also do is that you can provide a list of items that shall never be cached. So for instance, the geolocation file should never be cached because it needs the up-to-date position. What you can also do is fallback. So whenever some resource is loaded in offline mode and the resource is not in the application cache, you can show an error page. This error page, of course, is also in the application cache. So you could create whatever an error page, and this error page would then always be displayed when you try to access something offline, which is not in the application cache. Well, we do not need this now. I just want to show you how it's generally working. There is one catch, so to speak, one thing that's very often the source of an error. And this is that in order for this to work for the browser, you have to provide a specific content type. So you have to send out this manifest file. It has to have the correct format and has to have the correct content type, which is text/cache-manifest. All right, so this is my manifest file, and if I now have a new file, let's say I call it app cache, all I need to do now is when I have my HTML file, then in the HTML element, I just reference the manifest. Manifest equals, in my case, manifest.php. Usually, the manifest file is just a text file, and you configure Apache or whatever server you're using so that the correct MIME type is served. But I just kind of tricked here, if you want, by providing it that way. Now, if you're using, for instance, Chrome as an example, there is a specific built-in viewer for app cache contents in Chrome. It's a specific URL, chrome://app cache internals. And this just gives us a list of stuff that's in the app cache. Well, obviously there's nothing in the app cache right now, but if I take the URL here and then call app cache PHP, turning on the console first, then what we see here is while we load the page, it sees that there is a manifest, and then some event handling happens. For instance, it loads the elements PHP and the offline PHP files. These were the two files I just mentioned in the manifest. So it loads the files and stores them in the app cache. And if we now go back to app cache internals, then indeed I have an entry here in my manifest, and just open up your Chrome and look if you have something in the app cache and see whether any sites are using that. For instance, and this brings me back one final time to the calendar. For my private appointments, I'm using Google Calendar. And they have an offline feature like that. And if you have that installed and in Chrome go to app cache internals, you see that, for instance, most of the calendar app is in the app cache. So that's why it can load even while offline. So that's actually really nicely done. And bringing all that together, we have our calendar app, right? So we load the app. When we load it, the manifest takes care that the app is stored in app cache. And then we use local storage, session storage, and the navigator.online feature in order to make it run. Now, we have now more and more JavaScript code, and sometimes this JavaScript code just gets, well, more and more complex. I would say it gets too complex. So let me create some JavaScript for you with a typical way of doing whatever, some calculations, for instance. So let's say var j equals 0 for var I equals 0, I equal, oh, what the heck. J plus equals, it's a math.random times math.random, takes a while, and then console log j, or alert j. All right, sounds good, doesn't it? So let's do the calculation. And you see that this kinda kills my browser, right? And of course, you have never seen this before, never for your own code. Oh, I get a result. That was unexpected. Elephant time. Okay, come on. Let's just add a 0 just for the fun of it. But you see the browser is stalling, and eventually the browser will bring up one of these error windows. A slow-running script is kind of affecting your browser. Do you want to cancel script execution? That here. That's embarrassing. We want to avoid that, right? Now, the heuristics that are used here when to display that, they are different in different browsers. So sometimes the number of CPU cycles used, or the number of seconds, or the number of instructions before any UI update was done. And the main problem here is that browsers more or less, I'm simplifying a bit here, more or less have a single-threaded mode. So JavaScript code and the rendering and UI input and everything runs more or less in a single thread. So if JavaScript is just filling up all resources because we have such complex calculations, and of course my calculation is silly, but if you have complex JavaScript code, then your calculations won't be that silly, and you still put some burden on the browser. So eventually the browser might lock up as well. If that shows up, well, we are kind of host, and we cannot really avoid that because it's a protection mechanism built into browsers, so we cannot deactivate it. However, what we can do is we can try to avoid it. We can avoid it in a specific way. I create a new file, and this time I create a JavaScript file. I call this dub.js, and I just refactor my code. I just move this to the JavaScript file and then modify it a little bit. Because the feature I'd like to talk about is web workers. Web workers is an API, or uses a specific API, the messaging API, that's also new. And the messaging API allows, let's just say, two components to exchange data. And what I'm doing here is I put the complex code in a JavaScript file, which then runs in the background, I would say. So a JavaScript code which runs independent of all of the UI, and so hopefully does not lock up the browser. Now, before I do my calculation, I should probably wait for some instructions to start the calculation. So there is a message event, so I can set a message event handler, and I get some data being passed to that event handler. So I could, whenever I get a message, I could have a look at the message, but I don't look at the message actually. I just, whenever the message comes, I just do my calculation, and in the end, I send the message back. I send a message back, and the message I want to send back is the number I just, well, calculated. Let's just remove a 0 so that this runs during the course of the session. So when I get a message, just do some calculation, and in the very end, send the message back. Now, what am I doing in my HTML page? In my HTML page, I create a new worker, because the JavaScript file is, so to speak, my worker. And this new worker is put in a file, so dub.js. And then I send a message, whatever, start. It doesn't matter what kind of message I'm sending, as long as I'm sending a message, because the way the JavaScript file works, you saw that earlier, is whenever a message comes in, I start with the calculation. So I just send a start message to a worker, and well, then I'm waiting until I, as the HTML page, do get a message. Function, and well, when I get a message and I'm lazy here, I just log it. I get an object back, and this object, among other things, contains a data property, and this data property will contain the actual result. Now, let's have a look at that in the browser, and I'll start with the network tab in Firebug. You see here that previously the PHP page was, PHP file was loaded, and now the PHP file and the JavaScript file are loaded. And so now he's doing the calculation, and indeed you just saw that calculations are finished. The browser didn't lock up. It wouldn't even lock up if I use a bit higher number. Let's be risky, 9. All right. So browser doesn't lock up. It still reacts. You see I can use the mouse pointer here. Everything works fine. It's so much better than before, and the actual calculation is done in the background. And eventually we get a result back, and the result contains a lot of stuff. Too much stuff actually for my taste. And somewhere down there we have, here it is, we have the data property, and the data property then contains the big result, right? So whenever you have complex code and run into performance issues there, this won't make your code faster. The only thing that makes your code faster is run it in Chrome. But this won't make your code faster, but it might prevent, or will certainly help prevent browser to lock up. And so that's, for me, that's one of the key features as well, because code does get more and more complex. Now, what you saw is, or what you also saw, is the messaging API. So this post message, on message, post message, on message. And that's something new for the web, because in the web, usually we have pull. We have request response, so if we want new data from the server, we have to ask the server, and then we get data back. But there is no push. So the server cannot just send us information. The server can only send us information when we have requested it. And this API this would allow push, right? So by creating a worker, we kind of instruct, not a server, but in this case a JavaScript file, but we instruct someone, something, to do some calculation and send us data whenever they see it fit. And this same API is also supported in other aspects of communication in HTML5's JavaScript APIs. There are things like WebSockets, for instance, and server-sent events, and they work kinda similar. Server-sent events almost the same, actually. So you send a request, and whenever the server wants to send you data, the server sends you data, and via an event handler, you are informed that data is coming back from the server, right? This is really convenient now. So no manual polling all of the time. The browser takes care of that. You just say connection to that endpoint, and please let me know when data is there. If not, please leave me alone. So this is really, really, really convenient. Instead of showing you that, I wanted to show you one more thing, and it also has to do with communication, and it's also a feature that hasn't been there previously. Now, first let me maybe show you, I have another server here. I call it external. Now, actually, external is an internal server, but external is, of course, as you can see, is a different URL. So if I wanted to do an AJAX request from localhost to external, it wouldn't work because it would violate the same origin policy. And the same origin policy, there's a good reason why the same origin policy is there, but same origin policy, of course, is something that makes many, many AJAX applications, well, either not possible or you have to revert to hacks like JSONP or any other kind of workarounds, because you cannot change the origin. With AJAX, if you are on localhost, you can only send AJAX requests to localhost. This has changed as well. You can now send cross-domain HTTP requests. And the term for that is CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. But of course, there's a catch, right? Because just having no same origin policy any longer means security vulnerabilities or security issues. And of course, these security issues always relate to the server because the server gets those unwanted requests. Now, actually, there is a solution. So let me whip that up really quick for you. So I start with my doc tab again, HTML, and then my JavaScript code. And you know how it works. So I do an XML HTTP request. Then I open a connection to, with HTTP GET, for instance, to whatever endpoint, course endpoint, PHP, in an asynchronous fashion. And eventually I'm sending data, and then usually I would do on ready state change, but nowadays we can do stuff like on load function, and then console log XHR response text, for instance. So I'm sending a regular HTTP request. However, this endpoint now is lying on external HTML5 course endpoint. And this usually will not work, right? Because same origin policy is violated. Now, let's create this endpoint. So course endpoint. And what this endpoint is doing is it sends out JSON encode array 1, 2, 3. So it sends some data back. However, before that, it could have a look at the request. And if it thinks that the request comes from a site we trust, then we handle it. If not, we don't. Now, the browser, of course, needs to know if the server is okay with the request being sent. So the browser expects that the server sends back a specific HTTP header. If the HTTP header comes back, the browser knows server is okay with the request. I give JavaScript access to the data. If the header is not there, no access to the data. There are different options, but the most simple one for us now is we set the access control allow origin to star, right, wildcard. So we send this specific header. Now, if you're calling this in our browser, let's open maybe the network tab. Then you see, indeed, a request was sent to the course endpoint we created. The console has an output of the data that came from the server. Now let's dive into that. So we send a GET request, and we see that in response, we have our new header, access control allow origin. But there is a surprise in the request. The request has a new header, origin, the site this request came from. This was set by the browser. This is kind of the security feature. The browser tells the server where the request actually comes from, and the server can have a look at the origin and then decide yes or no. This is actually quite convenient because it requires very little interaction on the server, almost no interaction or no action on the browser, but gives us cross-domain HTTP requests. And this is one more reason why I'm really psyched about HTML5. Well, there are some maybe lowlights. Progress is a bit difficult. I mean, HTML5 is scheduled now to be done by end of 2014 or in 2014, but we all know in software, right? It means end of 2014. And a version 5.1 is following in 2 years later. Now, I mean, if you think about your past software projects, has there been a project where you told someone, yeah, we will deliver late, but we'll deliver, but we have already a schedule for the first minor new release after that? That means you are not done in time, right? So this doesn't give you, of course, the best feelings, but modern browsers already support most of that. There are some APIs which are strange. My prime example is the drag and drop API. The drag and drop API, there's a drag and drop API. I mean, everybody needs drag and drop, right? There is a drag and drop API, and this API is kind of standardized because there is a reference implementation. The reference implementation for that API, or well, maybe not the reference implementation, but the role model for this API is IE5. So there is a drag and drop API that was introduced in Internet Explorer 5. For some reason, the other browsers didn't kind of put that in their products. Go figure. And the API we have now looks exactly the same, or almost exactly the same. It is a pain in the rear. Seriously, don't use that API. Trust me, I did. And look at me now. Don't use the API. Please don't do that. I mean, there are so many great frameworks that do that. jQuery UI has behaviors for that, and all the other frameworks have that as well. Don't use the drag and drop API. I mean, there is some sense in the drag and drop API because one other thing is the file API. There might be a way to get metadata on files which are dragged and dropped on your browser. So, for instance, you could say, dear user, go to your Explorer or Finder, whatever OS you're using, take a file and drop it on the browser, and then the browser could access some data, maybe some metadata or whatever, maybe some content, who knows. And actually, there are some very interesting scenarios that would be possible then. But there is some time until this has been fully implemented in all browsers. And until then, use a framework. Do not use the drag and drop API. Apart from that, I'm really excited about HTML5. And we've created some really awesome projects with that. And we continue doing so. And are already planning what other things of HTML5 we could exploit for an interesting use case or scenario. And I hope you will do that too and have great fun with HTML5 and also had a little bit of fun with the session today. Please rate the session. Please contact me if any questions come up or if you'd like to discuss. I'll also be in the hallway track right after the talk. Apart from that, enjoy the almost last day of the conference. Please go to the hackathon tonight. And thank you very much.